We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. But tonight is different. Tonight we are not covering a search. We are not covering a press conference. We are not covering a forensic update or a new lead from the field. Tonight we are going inside the room where this case changed. 10 feet by 12 feet. Cold. Quiet. Designed for one purpose. To test the truth. There is a moment in every investigation when everything shifts. Not because of one dramatic discovery. Not because of a single piece of evidence. But because the story someone has been telling stops matching the facts. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, that moment happened inside that room. And over the next 35 minutes, we are going to walk through every part of it. The strategy, the pressure, the behavioral tells, the contradiction that cracked the timeline open, and the phrase 4 words that changed the direction of this entire case. Let's go. Before anything else, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because in this video, we are answering the one question that has defined this entire case. And if you want every update as this investigation moves forward, you need to be here. Now, the house. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, had been missing for days by the time investigators fully understood what they were dealing with. At first, the situation had been treated the way many missing person cases begin: concern, search efforts, waiting, the hope that there is an explanation that does not require what comes next. But something did not sit right from the beginning. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse was inside the house. Her phone had not moved. Those details matter more than they seem, because people who leave voluntarily, people who walk out of their lives, even temporarily, do not leave everything behind. They take what they need. They take what connects them to the outside world. Nancy had taken nothing. That was the first contradiction. The second came from the house itself. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, no evidence of someone pushing their way through a barrier. But there were signs of something else. Subtle at first. Easy to miss in the early hours of a response that did not fully understand what it was looking at. Scuff marks along the hallway floor. Not random marks. Not the kind left by foot traffic or routine movement. These were directional, measured later at nearly 6 feet in length. 6 feet. That measurement matters because it is too long for a stumble, too long for a fall, too consistent for an accident. What it is consistent with, what investigators recognized almost immediately once the full picture came into focus, is a body being moved, not running, not struggling desperately. Something heavier, something deliberate. That is when the tone of the investigation changed, quietly at first, but definitively. Because once you see evidence of movement like that, measured, directional, 6 feet down a hallway, you are no longer dealing with a disappearance. You are dealing with an event. And events have causes. Now investigators began looking at everyone connected to Nancy Guthrie's last known hours. Friends. Neighbors. Anyone who had contact with her that day. But one name stood out more than the others. Not because of speculation. Not because of public pressure. Because of proximity. Tommaso, her son-in-law. The last known person to see her alive. That fact alone does not imply guilt. In any investigation, proximity to the final known moment is simply where you begin. It is the starting point, not the conclusion. But Tommaso had a timeline. At least, he said he did. He told investigators that Nancy had been fine. That she had mentioned going out. That nothing unusual had happened. That his evening had been ordinary. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. But investigators do not work from what sounds reasonable. They work from what can be verified. And when they began verifying his timeline, something did not line up. Cell phone data. It showed movement. Not small movement. Not a brief deviation. Significant movement. Nearly 15 miles from the house. At a time when Tommaso had already told police he had never left. Take a moment with that, because that is not a rounding error. That is not a small discrepancy in timing or a misremembered detail. 15 miles is a distance. A deliberate, traceable, time-stamped distance. And he had said he never left. That is not a small inconsistency. That is a break. And breaks matter in a very specific way. Because when one part of a story breaks, when one verifiable element does not match what was said, everything else in that story becomes unstable. Every detail that had seemed solid suddenly requires re-examination. That is the moment the FBI became directly involved. Not as support, as lead. Because now the case required something more precise than a general interview. Something more controlled than a conversation over a kitchen table. It required a room. At the same time, Other elements of the physical scene were adding pressure to that same timeline. Neighbors. One had reported hearing a sound. Not prolonged, not repeated. A single impact. The kind of sound that stands out in a quiet neighborhood, precisely because it does not belong to routine. The timing of that sound placed it inside the same window as the movement on the phone. Not proof, but placement. And placement matters. Then came the delivery driver. Someone passing through. No connection to the family. No reason to be involved. But present at the right moment. He reported seeing a vehicle leaving the driveway. Faster than expected. Not reckless, but purposeful. Moving with direction, not hesitation. When physical observation matches digital data, when what someone saw aligns with what a phone recorded, the timeline strengthens. The story becomes harder to rewrite, and Tommaso's story was about to face that timeline directly. Most people's understanding of an interrogation comes from what they have seen on television. Raised voices, slammed tables, confrontation designed to break someone through force. That is not what this is. A real federal interrogation is something much quieter, much more patient, and in many ways much more difficult to endure. The room itself is part of the strategy. 10 by 12 feet. Controlled temperature. Controlled lighting. No clocks. Nothing decorative. Nothing that gives the person sitting across the table anything to focus on except the conversation and the people conducting it. That environment is not accidental. It is designed. Because when there is nothing else in the room to look at, everything the person does, every shift, every pause, every gesture, becomes visible in a way it would not be anywhere else. The goal of the room is not to force a confession. The goal is to remove every place a lie can hide. When Tommaso sat down with federal agents, he presented himself as expected. Concerned. Cooperative. Emotionally affected. He spoke like someone who wanted answers. Someone who was going through something difficult and was doing his best to help. But there was a problem. The evidence did not match the emotion. And investigators noticed that immediately. Because in real cases, emotion without alignment is a signal. Not proof, not a conclusion, but something that changes how you listen. So they began with simple questions, not the hard ones, not the ones connected to the break in the timeline. Just, where were you that afternoon? What did you do? Who did you speak to? Tommaso answered each one calmly, confidently, but the agents were not listening to the answers. Not yet. They were listening for consistency, because consistency is where the structure of a story either holds or starts to fracture. The first version always sounds rehearsed. What investigators are waiting for is the second version. And the third, because each time a story is told again, small differences appear. And small differences show you where the pressure is. The first cracks appeared when they brought up the phone data. He adjusted in his seat. He touched his collar. His eyes moved toward the camera. Not once, but multiple times. Small movements, easy to dismiss individually, but collectively, they told investigators something important. He knew the situation was no longer manageable. He tried to explain the distance. Said he went for a drive, said he needed space, but the explanation came after the evidence, not before it. And that matters, because truth usually arrives first. Explanations follow later when the truth needs support. When an explanation only appears after the evidence is presented, the order itself becomes a signal. At this point, the interrogation shifted. Not aggressively, strategically. The agents began focusing on time. Not hours. Minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Small windows. Asking him to explain them again and again. That repetition is intentional. Because when someone is not telling the full truth, time becomes the hardest thing to maintain. A fabricated story that covers a long period can hold its general shape. But a fabricated story tested minute by minute, asked about the same 10-minute window 3 times in 3 different ways, that story starts to move. Details change. Sequences shift. New information appears that was not in the first version. And that is exactly what happened. Tommaso's answers became longer, more detailed, but less consistent. That combination is critical. Because when someone tells the truth, the story stays the same with every telling. It might gain texture. It might add color. But the core remains stable. When someone is constructing a version of events, the opposite happens. Each telling adds material. More detail to fill in gaps. More explanation to cover inconsistencies. The story grows, but grows in the wrong direction. That is the difference between memory and construction. And investigators know how to tell them apart. Now behind that interrogation room, something else was happening. Other agents watching, listening. analyzing every response in real time, not just the words. Changes in tone, changes in posture, changes in breathing, the rate at which he was blinking, the way his hands moved between questions. These are not dramatic indicators. They are not the kind of thing most people would notice watching from the outside. But investigators are trained specifically to see them, because those micro-shifts indicate stress points, and stress points indicate where the truth is closest. The agents had already identified multiple stress points. The timeline, the location, the movement, all of them clustering around the same window of time. Now they began using silence. Silence is one of the most powerful tools in this environment. People do not like it. Silence creates pressure that words cannot, because words give you something to respond to. Silence gives you nothing, except the sound of your own thoughts. Tommaso shifted. He reached for the glass of water. He looked toward the camera again. That repeated behavior matters. Awareness of the camera is awareness of the record. And awareness of the record means awareness that whatever comes next cannot be taken back. Then the agents introduced the next layer. They showed him the data. Not all of it. Just enough. A map. A timestamp. A movement pattern. And then they waited. They did not explain it. They did not interpret it. They placed it in front of him and let it sit. Because sometimes evidence does not need a guide. It speaks by itself. Tommaso looked at the image. Then away. Then back again. Repetition indicates recognition, not confusion. And then they introduced the tire impressions. Tire impressions are often underestimated by the public. But investigators understand exactly what they are worth. Because they do something that digital data alone cannot fully accomplish. They connect a physical vehicle to a physical location. Not in theory. In material evidence that can be measured, photographed, and compared. In this case, the impressions match Tommaso's vehicle. Not broadly. Not approximately. Specifically. He was no longer just present in the digital timeline. He was physically present at a location away from the house, at a time he said he had not been there. That is not a small inconsistency. That is a structural break. And structural breaks change everything. By the time the interrogation reached its later hours, something had already shifted. Not in the evidence. The evidence had been consistent throughout, in the person sitting across from it. Because there is a point in every sustained interview where maintaining a version of events becomes harder than adjusting it. Where the energy required to hold the story together exceeds the energy available. That is where Tommaso was now. His approach up to this point had been structured. Answer the question. Stay calm. Keep the timeline intact. Each response measured and controlled. But the problem was no longer the questions. It was the weight of everything surrounding them. Because by this point, the agents had done something very deliberate. They had removed every place his story could rest. The timeline did not hold. The movement did not align. The physical evidence contradicted his account. The tire impressions placed him somewhere he said he had not been. When those elements break at the same time, the structure does not collapse immediately. It collapses gradually. And you can see it happen in small ways if you are trained to look. First, the pauses between answers grow longer. Then, the responses become less direct. Then, the person begins looking for something outside the conversation. Not at anything specific. Just somewhere that is not the room. Tommaso began looking down more often. That behavior is not random. It is avoidance. And avoidance appears when a person is trying to manage internal pressure that has nowhere left to go. The agents did not interrupt that process. They let it happen. Because forcing a break too early, pushing too hard before the moment is ready, can push someone back into resistance. The walls go back up. The story resets. And you lose the ground you have built. Instead, they waited. And then they changed approach. Not the pressure, the direction of it. They stopped focusing on contradiction. And started focusing on sequence. Walk us through it again. That instruction is simple. It is also one of the most precisely targeted things an investigator can say at this moment. Because it does not accuse. It does not challenge. It just asks for repetition. And repetition exposes instability in a way confrontation never can. When Tommaso began speaking again, the differences were clearer. He slowed down. He hesitated between details. He corrected himself mid-sentence. Those are not dramatic changes. But they are important ones. They show effort, and effort suggests construction. Then the agents narrowed further. Not the whole day, not the full evening, just one segment, one specific block. Tell us what happened after you saw her. That question is architecturally different from everything that came before it. It removes everything else. It places all attention on one moment, the last confirmed moment, and it waits. Tommaso paused longer than he had before. Then he answered. But this time the answer was shorter. Less detailed. And when detail disappears, it usually means the person is approaching something they do not want to explain. The agents leaned in slightly. They did not interrupt. They did not react. They simply remained focused. That creates a different kind of pressure. Not external, internal. The silence is no longer neutral. It is expectant. Tommaso shifted again. His hands moved to the glass of water. And this time, the movement was less controlled. The water spilled slightly onto the table. In an interrogation setting, physical control mirrors emotional control. When one starts to slip, the other follows. The agents placed the photograph on the table. The secondary location. The area where his phone had been tracked. The area where the tire impressions were found. They did not explain it. They let him look. He looked at the image. Then away. Then back. Recognition. Not confusion. And then 4 words. It got out of control. The room did not react. The agents did not interrupt. They did not jump on it. Did not lean forward. Did not exchange a look. They acknowledged it with the quiet, focused attention of people who had been waiting for exactly this, and knew that the next 30 seconds would determine how much more followed. Because those 4 words had done something that hours of questioning had been building toward. They had moved the conversation from denial to explanation. And once someone begins explaining, they have already stepped away from complete denial. That is the turning point. I want to take a second here, because if you have stayed with this video to this point, you understand why this case is different from how most places have covered it. This channel exists to go through every layer. Not the surface version, the actual version. If that is what brought you here, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment below with what you think happened in that room. I read every single one. Now, the reconstruction. The moment did not come all at once. There was no sudden outburst. No raised voice. No dramatic confession in the way people imagine when they hear that word. It came quietly. And that is what made it significant. Because in investigations like this, the truth rarely arrives in a single statement. It arrives in fragments, and those fragments have to be understood carefully, cross-referenced, tested, compared against the physical evidence already collected. When Tommaso first said it got out of control, that phrase did something very specific. It moved the conversation from denial to explanation. Once someone begins explaining, once they have moved out of the position of nothing happened, the question is no longer whether something occurred. It is what. The agents adjusted their posture slightly. Not aggressively. Just enough to signal that the conversation had changed, that what came next was what everything before it had been building toward. Tommaso kept his head lowered. His voice was quieter now. Not controlled. Measured. And there is a difference. Controlled speech is intentional. It is managed, before it leaves the mouth. Measured speech is cautious. It is chosen word by word, in the moment, by someone trying to manage what they reveal without fully closing the door. He described an argument. Not a loud one. Not something that escalated immediately. Something that had been building. A history of tension compressed into a single night. That detail matters, because it introduces not just an event, but a context. And context changes everything about how an event is understood. He spoke about money. Not in detail. Not with specifics. But enough for investigators to register it. Because financial disputes are one of the most consistent factors in cases involving people who are close to one another. Not always. Not automatically. But consistently enough that investigators do not hear the word money in this context, without noting it. Then he approached the moment itself. And this is where his language changed. When people approach the most critical part of an event, the part they have been managing around for hours, their language becomes less precise. Not because the memory is unclear, because the words are. He said she fell. He did not describe how. He did not describe the exact position, the exact moment, the mechanics of what preceded it. He said it happened quickly. And that is where the agents focused. Not on challenging the statement. Not on contradicting it. On understanding it. Walk us through it. Not a demand. An invitation. And Tommaso responded, this time slower, more detailed. He described where they were standing. The position in the room, the distance between them. Those details matter because they are testable. They can be compared against the physical environment. Against the scuff marks in the hallway. Against the measurements already taken. Against the evidence already collected. And that is exactly what investigators were doing as he spoke. Not just listening. Mapping. Does what he is describing align with what they have already seen? Now, as he continued, something else emerged. His account did not include immediate action. He did not describe calling for help. He did not describe checking for a response. He did not describe doing anything that a person in crisis, a person who had witnessed an accident, would instinctively do. Instead, he described hesitation. Standing there, looking, not knowing what to do. That detail is critical, because in moments of genuine crisis, behavior is automatic. People call, people check, people react before they think. That is not a choice. It is a physiological response to witnessing something traumatic. Delayed response, standing and waiting and thinking, is something investigators examine very closely, because it suggests that in the moment, the priority was not helping. It was deciding. Now the conversation moved forward, from the moment itself to what followed. And this is where things become even more important, because what someone does after an event often tells investigators more than the event itself. In law, the distinction between reaction and decision is the difference between two fundamentally different categories of outcome. A reaction is involuntary, something that happens before the mind has fully engaged. A decision is deliberate, something that happens after the mind has assessed the situation and chosen a direction. What follows an event defines intent, and intent defines everything else. Tommaso described time passing, not in exact minutes, in phases, moving through the house, not cleaning, not acting with urgency, but thinking, processing, trying, in his words, to understand what had just happened. That description established something critical, a gap between event and response. And gaps are where decisions are made. When the agents guided him further, when they pressed beyond the gap into what came after it, his account began to describe action. Not immediate action, eventual action, and the nature of that action is what changed the tone of everything. Because the action he described was not emergency response, not calling for help, not seeking assistance, it was managing the environment. That distinction is the most legally significant thing in this entire interrogation. Because emergency response and environmental management are not the same behavior. One is automatic, the other is considered. One happens when panic takes over. The other happens when calculation takes over. And calculation, in a moment like this, means one thing. He had decided what to do. Before he did it, the agents did not interrupt this part. They let it continue. They let him build the account with as little guidance as possible. Because every detail he added voluntarily was a detail that came from him, not from a question, not from a prompt, from his own account. As he continued, his voice became steadier. Not because he was more confident, because he had moved past resistance. Once someone begins explaining, the pressure changes. It is no longer about holding something back. It is about controlling what is revealed, the order of events, the timing, the movement between rooms. All of it matters, and all of it was being mapped in real time against everything investigators already knew. Outside the interrogation room, another team was already preparing. Because statements alone are never enough. They must be supported. They must be tested against the physical scene with new context. And that is exactly what happened next. The physical scene was revisited. Not as a fresh investigation, as a confirmation. The hallway marks were measured again. Compared to the distances described in the interrogation room, the positions described, where they were standing, the distance between them, were evaluated against the physical layout. Does what he described match what was already there? When reconstruction aligns with physical evidence, when the words spoken inside that room match the marks found in the house, the case strengthens in a way no single piece of evidence can accomplish alone. Because alignment is confirmation. And when reconstruction does not align, when something he described cannot be reconciled with the physical environment, it raises new questions. Questions that require new answers. At the same time, the secondary location became even more important than it had been before. The area identified through digital movement, the area where the vehicle had traveled, the area where the tire impressions had been found. That location was no longer just a data point in a timeline. It was part of a sequence, and sequence is what allows investigators to move forward. Because sequence connects intention to action. It connects the moment inside the house to the decisions made after it. Now the case was no longer what it had been at the beginning. At the beginning, this was a missing person case. An 84-year-old woman gone from her home. No forced entry. No clear explanation. Just absence. By the time investigators walked out of that room, the absence had been replaced with structure. A timeline. A sequence. A set of decisions. And decisions define responsibility. Now step back. Not to repeat what we already know, but to understand what it means. Nancy Guthrie was last known to be inside her home. There was no forced entry. Which means she allowed someone inside, or that person already had access. That detail alone removes the idea of randomness. This was not chance. This was connection. The environment was quiet, controlled, a neighborhood where unfamiliar movement stands out. Which means, whatever happened in a space where visibility was deliberately limited. The timeline is fixed. The last confirmed movement. The gap that followed. The movement of a phone away from that location. All of it contained within a defined window. The physical evidence is directional. 6 feet. Measured, consistent with movement rather than accident. The digital evidence places a phone 15 miles from where it was supposed to be. The tire impressions connect a vehicle to a location no one should have needed to visit. And the words spoken inside that room, the phrase, the hesitation, the reconstruction, all move in the same direction. Not toward uncertainty. Toward sequence. A sequence that begins inside the home and continues beyond it. Now consider the family. Because while investigators build cases, families live through them. Day after day, not waiting for analysis, not waiting for timelines, waiting for answers. Savannah Guthrie has spoken consistently throughout this case. Not with speculation, not with theory, with one message, repeated and unchanged. Her mother did not simply disappear. Something happened to her. And truth matters. When a case moves from missing to explained, it does not remove the loss. But it changes the direction of it. It allows for accountability. It allows for the kind of understanding that grief cannot find without it. And that is what this entire process is working toward. Not a dramatic moment. Not a single revelation. Accumulation. Layer after layer, until the picture becomes unavoidable. But even with everything that now exists in this case, even with the structure, the alignment, the evidence, one thing remains missing. Nancy Guthrie herself. And that absence is what defines everything. Because resolution is not just about understanding what happened. It is about finding the person at the center of it. Without that, the story remains incomplete. Before this ends, there is something that matters more than any analysis. If you know anything at all, no matter how small it seems, this is the moment to come forward. You do not need certainty. You do not need proof. You do not need to have the full picture. Investigators build the case. You provide the detail. FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Online, tips.fbi.gov. Total reward, $1,100,000 to $1 million from the family. $100,000 from the FBI. Fully anonymous. No name required. No exposure. Nancy Guthrie is not a case file. She is a person. A mother. A grandmother. Someone who had routines and plans and people who expected to hear from her. And this case is not over. Not until she is found. Cases like this do not resolve in the way people expect. There is no single moment where everything becomes clear all at once. Instead, it is accumulation. Quiet, methodical. One layer at a time, until the picture becomes unavoidable. And that is exactly where this investigation is heading. Subscribe, hit the bell, drop a comment below. Because this case is still moving, and this channel will be here every time it does. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. And neither is this.